Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present in this House our practical ideas seeking to make the Senate more accountable to Canadians. When Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, when the Prime Minister and the Conservatives were elected, they promised Senate reform. They also promised to clean up the appointment process. 7 years later, nothing has yet been done in this regard, except that the Prime Minister has appointed 59 new senators. The Liberals and the Conservatives claim that the Senate is essential to our parliamentary system because it is, in their opinion, the House of sober second thought, which also gives a voice to the regions. In reality, Mr. Speaker, the Senate is simply a den for organizers, contributors, and fundraisers of the Conservative Party, and most of the time they act in the sole interests of their political party. Canadians have had enough. They're fed up, Mr. Speaker, with this unelected and unaccountable Senate that is constantly under investigation. Most Canadians agree with the NDP and feel that the Senate should be abolished. The abolition of the Senate has long been part of a broader vision of democratic reform on the part of the NDP, and this idea still underpins our vision of this country, and most Canadians agree with us. But in the meantime, the path to abolishing the Senate means that the Conservatives and Liberals must take measures to correct their errors because the status quo is no longer good enough. The NDP is defending Canadians' values with this proposal and is proposing concrete measures to make the Senate more accountable to all Canadians. And I should say, Mr. Speaker, that I will be splitting my time with the honourable member for Timmins James Bay. No explanation can justify the fact that unelected officials should use taxpayers' money and Senate resources for partisan purposes. The Liberals and the Conservatives defend the Senate, claiming that it is the House of sober second thought. But if that is true, then senators should drop their partisan talking points and study legislation in an impartial and nonpartisan manner as persons who are appointed rather than elected, like judges or other government officials who are paid by taxpayers. They must do very specific work. They must start to do their work in an impartial fashion and in a nonpartisan manner as well.
Very perceptive observations of a century ago, recorded literally half a century ago in Robert McKay's classic book, The Unreformed Senate of Canada. And the quotation from 1913, published in the National Review in London, is from a certain gentleman named Professor Stephen Leacock, who had the following to say, quote, "Liberals and Conservatives combined, we made our Senate not a superior council of the nation, but a refuge of place-hunting politicians and a reward for partisan adherence." End of quotation. Mr. McKay in his book, Mr. Speaker, goes on to say the following, quote, "Such statements, though rhetorical, are on the whole still true." And he's speaking in 1963. "Appointment of party supporters is an all but unbroken tradition. During his 19 years of office, Sir John Macdonald appointed only one Liberal and one Independent. Sir Wilfrid Laurier appointed none but Liberals." End of quote. Mr. McKay then goes on to draw attention to a debate in the House of Commons in 1906, where the Prime Minister of the time, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, was asked the following question: "Does the right honourable gentleman say that under our present Constitution he feels he must select appointees of his own party when choosing them. That was the question asked of the Prime Minister, and Sir Wilfrid Laurier responded, quote, "If I have to select between a Tory and a Liberal, I feel I can serve the country better by appointing a Liberal than a Conservative." End of quotation. Mr. Speaker, nothing better conveys the connection between prime ministerial prerogative, patronage, and the undue hyperpartisanship of the chamber we call the Senate. And I would end by quoting again Mr. McKay, where he says, quote, "Senatorships have often been granted as pensions to the deserving poor among party supporters in the House of Commons and provincial legislatures, or as honours to editors of the faithful press, party organisers, or to contributors to the war chest." What has changed, Mr. Speaker? My colleagues today will lay out how too many current Conservative and Liberal senators fit this tradition all too well. I won't go into those details, but one figure perhaps tells all. In the government's own factum before the Supreme Court and the reference on the question of Senate reform and abolition, the government itself tells us that 95% of appointments to the Senate since the Senate began have been of persons of the same party as the appointing Prime Minister. 95%. Nothing has changed, Mr. Speaker, from those quotations from 1913 and 1963. I think Canadians would be interested, Mr. Speaker, to know about the Senate administrative rules of 2004, which are not online, which are not available for Canadians to see unless they go through a special effort to ask for a copy to be sent to them. In Chapter 1, Clause 3, various principles of parliamentary life are set out. Quote, "The following principles of parliamentary life apply in the administration of the Senate. B, partisan activities are an inherent and essential part of the parliamentary functions of a senator." How so, Mr. Speaker? I can't wait to hear today from the members of the other parties how partisanship aids in fulfilling the supposed purposes of the Senate, let alone how it is an inherent and an essential function. The Senate has not bothered to remove this provision, even though this last year it did amend some of the administrative rules on travel. A senator, quote, "in the principles is further entitled to receive financial resources and administrative services to carry out the Senator's parliamentary functions, and a senator has full discretion over and control of the work performed on the senator's behalf in carrying out parliamentary functions." So this whole question of parliamentary functions continues throughout the rules, and basically a senator is prohibited from using his offices or her offices and other resources for anything but parliamentary functions, but the definition and the approach to parliamentary functions throughout the document and what we know throughout the long-standing practice of the Senate is to include almost everything but the kitchen sink. The rules go into some detail to exclude certain things as expenses that can be recovered. For example, no senator shall request the copying or printing of material by the Senate that is partisan because it is on a party letterhead or includes a party logo, and so on. A senator may not charge the following expenses to the senator's office budget: payments to partisan organizations. Wow. Another provision under travel says you can't actually use Senate money to campaign during an election. It says nothing about outside. These specifications are clear in what they exclude. They exclude from partisanship almost nothing. So parliamentary functions of the Senate include almost everything, Mr. Speaker. I would end there, Mr. Speaker, by making one final comment. It's not a lot better, in fact, it's no better at all, if senators travel around the country as propagandists for the sitting government. If they go around the country showing up on behalf of the government on the Senate dime, not on the government dime. It's not so different from the way in which this government is using advertising through government dollars to convey a partisan message. So much more I could say, Mr. Speaker, but I will leave it to my honourable colleagues who will no doubt say it much better than I. Thank you.